All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about materials, a little introduction. And this slide is a slide of what I would prefer to avoid, and I'm sure the other instructors would also prefer to avoid this too. So if you look at this view, we have a huge piece of stone that is just spanning this entire floor. And then we have some UVW mapping issues over here where it's sort of stretching that texture vertically up a wall. So what I would suggest is to stay away from sort of in-between views where you have, this is really more schematic with the background, but maybe this just needs to be gray with a little texture and not a realistic looking stone that is completely out of scale. So there's an imbalance there. The other part is that we have this sort of endless sky background, which is also really odd. So don't let the computer background or program dictate an inappropriate presentation for your view. Like if you want this to accentuate the length of this hallway and light versus dark, then this is actually quite distracting to that. I don't think it's indicative of the actual design purpose. So always keep that in mind, and I would start with doing renderings of a white model to see the light and then slowly bring up the materials. And again, here, the application of the stone on this wall is, really beyond comment. It's more of a gaming, and then the green grass. These are like pasting materials onto things, which is the absolute thing we want to avoid, right? So please make efforts to avoid this situation and keep it simple in the beginning and work your materials up, slowly. So here's a slide of some students. This is Johanna and Sophia, that they actually did these renderings originally in Revit, and then of course obviously post-processed them quite a bit in Photoshop, and then printed them on some canvas, and they ended up looking very nice. They don't have sort of that strange realistic look. They did a very nice job of scaling the materials and abstracting them. The horizon lines are appropriate. They're not clouds disappearing. Even here there's a little bit of a transition there. So those are the things that I would look for. Here's a different type of rendering. I think this one is pretty successful. Oftentimes you'll see brick used quite poorly, but this one is coupled with the detail of the veneer of the brick, which this definitely looks like a veneer brick. The only thing I would say about this one is that the detail and the rendering unfortunately don't match. Like there's quite a drop here with this steel sill, and that is not indicated here in the image. So I would, hope that if you have a detail next to an image that they would match. But nevertheless, this is actually quite a nice, simple rendering of what potentially the face of this brick looks like. And the brick is pretty close, right? They did make efforts to make the brick break on the windows, which I appreciate, instead of just having like weird pieces of brick clunking up against the corner as if they had been cut. Okay, so always when you're using materials in a realistic sense, apply them in a constructive way. In other words, in the way they would be constructed. Otherwise, just abstract it, like with horizontal lines or something like that. In Revit, the materials are a lot more than just textures, and that's pretty much what we focus on in architecture. So what we're going to take a look at here is the different parts of the Revit materials. So this is the material browser here, and here's the material library. These are the materials that are in the Revit project, and down below you have material libraries that are on your hard drive. Here's the identity data tab for Revit. It just has a lot of information about, the class, comments, keywords, manufacturer, the cost, right? Your keynotes and your marks for the material callouts. There's also a physical and a thermal tab that you typically wouldn't think would be in a material in another program. So it actually has the strength of the material and the thermal qualities of the material. These are in addition to these two tabs, which we'll look at in just a minute, the graphics and appearance, which is what we tend to focus on when we're rendering. So what it looks like in the viewport and what it looks like when you render it. All of these are accessed from the Manage tab and the Materials button. So let's take a look at the two tabs that we sort of obsess on. One is the Graphics tab. This controls what the material looks like in the viewport of the program, so not rendered. So what does it look like when you shade it? If you click Use Render Appearance, it will average whatever the render image is and give you that color. You can uncheck that and pick any color you want. You can give it transparency here. The surface pattern is the elevation pattern. So does it have lines? Does it have a crosshatch? Does it have no pattern? You know, does it have, what is the color of the pattern? And you can do a texture alignment. So you can adjust where the texture is crossing the pattern if you would like. The cut pattern is the section. So the material controls the section cut color and pattern. So unless you put an override on it, the section cut, fill, and color will come out as the material indicates. Okay. The Appearance tab controls how the material looks when it renders. So this one has an image on it of concrete cast in place. It also has a bump map on it, right? So it comes in and places this bump map, which is a false relief. It also has a little bit of weathering on it. This is actually a concrete template that Revit will use, and we'll look at we'll look at the default template, and we're going to use that to make ours. And we'll look at the different types of maps that you can put on it. If you click on the image, it will bring up this little texture editor where you have access to control many aspects of this, you know, such as you can invert the image, you can control brightness, offsets, and scale, and repeats. Okay, so we'll take a look at that as well. So here is an example of a surface pattern. So that would be like an elevational pattern. And then the cut pattern we were looking at, so the section pattern was gray, and then it was shading a dark gray. These are examples of the JPEGs that were being used to create those concrete patterns, and they're pretty rough looking. Here's an alternate one that you could have that's like a square concrete pattern. These below here are being used as bump maps. So bump maps, if anything is white, it comes forward, and if anything is dark, it goes back, so it creates a false relief, and we'll take a look at how those work as well.